There are some stories that do not begin with joy, nor do they unfold in the glow of warm family photographs. Instead, they start in silence, with betrayal echoing louder than words. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a forgotten cabin stood half-broken, its walls weathered by storms and its roof caved in under decades of neglect. Yet inside, an elderly black couple, Joseph and Lorraine Matthews, carried a secret so heavy it could crush the spirit of the strongest among us. They had once been parents to 6 children, children they had loved, nurtured, and raised with every ounce of devotion 2 hearts could give. But now, not one of them returned their calls. Not one of them visited during holidays. They were abandoned, left to fade away in a cabin that had become more prison than home. But this was no ordinary tale of neglect. Behind their isolation lay the bitter truth of race, rejection, and a society that saw them as less. They had believed adoption would save children from pain, would build a family that stretched beyond bloodlines. Instead, their own children, some born to privilege, some to despair, would turn their backs when the world whispered poison in their ears. Still, what Joseph and Lorraine did next was nothing short of extraordinary. Instead of surrendering to loneliness, they transformed their pain into something breathtaking. Piece by piece, plank by plank, they rebuilt the ruined cabin into a sanctuary, an Eden in the mountains, a paradise carved out of brokenness. But the true miracle was not the wood and stone. It was the resilience of 2 black souls who refused to be defined by abandonment. This is their story of betrayal, perseverance, and a love for life so unshakable it could turn ruins into paradise. Joseph Matthews had been born in the Deep South in the late 1940s, in a world where the color of his skin dictated the limits of his opportunities. He grew up watching his father rise before dawn to work land that never belonged to him and return home with aching hands and calloused pride. Lorraine, born a few states north in a segregated town, carried memories of being turned away from the front door of stores, her mother forced to buy groceries through a back alley. Both had learned young what it meant to endure. But endurance, they discovered, did not rob them of tenderness. When Joseph and Lorraine met in their early 20s, they found in each other a quiet strength. Their marriage was never built on grand gestures or lavish wealth. It was woven instead from shared struggles and dreams whispered late at night about a better life. They had prayed for children, but after years of unanswered hope and heartbreak, they were told their chances of conceiving were slim. Lorraine wept for days, believing that motherhood had been stolen from her, until Joseph held her hands one evening and said, "Maybe the world has children waiting for us. Maybe our family will be found, not born." That was how they turned to adoption. In the 1970s and 1980s, adoption was not an easy journey for a black couple. Agencies often questioned their ability to provide, doubted their financial stability, and, though rarely said aloud, judged the worthiness of black families in a system that leaned toward placing children with white households. Still, Joseph and Lorraine persisted. Over the years, they adopted 6 children from different backgrounds. Some were babies, abandoned at birth. Others were older, carrying the scars of foster care. For Joseph and Lorraine, it did not matter. Every child was theirs, welcomed with open arms and unconditional love. The Matthews household was far from rich, but it overflowed with warmth. Lorraine cooked stews that stretched across days, and Joseph often fixed up old bicycles from junkyards so the children could ride through the streets like they owned the world. Their home became a refuge, a place where bedtime stories soothed nightmares and prayers at the dinner table reminded them that family was sacred. Neighbors admired their devotion, though whispers sometimes floated about how those children would turn out. But as the children grew older, the outside world pressed in. Their skin tones, their roots, their fragmented identities were questioned at school and in society. Some of the children began to push back against Joseph and Lorraine, confused by their own struggles of identity. The Matthews, with all their love, could not shield their family from the weight of racism nor the sting of classmates' cruel words. "Why are your parents black?" one child recalled being asked in middle school, as though love could only follow bloodlines. Despite these tensions, Joseph and Lorraine never wavered in their role as parents. They attended graduations, worked multiple jobs to send kids to college, and even took out loans that nearly buried them in debt just to give their children opportunities they had never known themselves. They believed the sacrifices were worth it, believed that love, poured out over years, would bind their family forever. Yet, as time passed, the bonds they worked so hard to build began to fray. The children, one by one, drifted away. Some left chasing independence, others swayed by bitterness and resentment. Phone calls grew shorter, holidays quieter. Until one day, silence settled completely. No one visited. No one called. Joseph and Lorraine's hearts, once so full, were left echoing with absence. That was when they decided to leave behind the town where memories of rejection cut deepest. With their small savings, they bought a broken-down cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. It was barely standing, mildewed walls, a collapsed porch, a roof pocked with holes. Locals scoffed when they saw the couple moving in. But Joseph and Lorraine were not seeking approval. They were seeking peace. It was there, in the shadow of crumbling wood and endless forest, that their next chapter began. A chapter not of despair, but of transformation. The first winter in the mountain cabin nearly broke them. The roof leaked so badly that Joseph had to place tin buckets under the drips, and more than once, they awoke to find their blankets soaked. Lorraine huddled close to the fireplace, her joints stiff from the cold. Food was scarce. They survived on beans, rice, and whatever Joseph could hunt or fish from the nearby creek. Every creak of the wind outside made the house groan like a dying thing, and Lorraine would sometimes whisper, "Maybe we made a mistake." But Joseph always answered, steady and unwavering, "This house may be broken, but we aren't." It wasn't just the elements they battled. The closest town was small, tightly knit, and not entirely welcoming to outsiders, least of all a black couple who had arrived with little more than old suitcases and dreams. Whenever they drove into town for supplies, stares followed them. Some shopkeepers treated them with indifference, others with open hostility. Once, Joseph overheard two men laughing near the hardware store, muttering about how those people would never fix the place, how the mountains had a way of spitting folks like them back out. Lorraine, with her quiet dignity, carried those wounds silently. She knew that, even in her twilight years, she could not escape the burden of her skin color. But she refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she poured her energy into small acts of restoration. Each morning, after gathering firewood, she would sweep the warped wooden floors, as though brushing away not just dust but despair itself. She planted seeds in a small patch of dirt outside the cabin, coaxing life from soil that seemed unwilling to give. Joseph, meanwhile, attacked the cabin with determination. He patched holes in the roof with scrap metal, replaced rotten planks with salvaged wood, and built makeshift furniture out of logs. His hands, though arthritic, remembered the lessons of his father: how to build, how to mend, how to endure. Slowly, the ruined structure began to shift. It was still rough, still humble, but with every nail driven and every board replaced, the house became more theirs. The days were long, and the silence inside the cabin was sometimes unbearable. Lorraine often thought of their children. She remembered birthdays filled with laughter, the joy in their faces when Joseph pushed them on bicycles, the nights spent rocking feverish bodies until the sun rose. Now, all of it seemed like a dream. She wrote letters to them, dozens of them, pouring her heart onto paper, letters that went unanswered. Holidays came and went, the table always set for two, the phone never ringing. There were nights when Joseph sat outside on the porch, staring at the stars, asking silently what they had done wrong. He knew love had been given freely, sacrifices made, without hesitation. Yet the rejection from their children cut deeper than any insult from strangers. It was abandonment, pure and merciless, leaving wounds that could not be seen but never stopped bleeding. But something remarkable began to happen in the midst of that pain. The cabin, once a decaying shell, began to breathe with new life. Lorraine's gardens sprouted vegetables, bright and defiant against the rocky soil. Joseph built a chicken coop from discarded wire, and soon fresh eggs appeared on their table. Wildflowers began to grow where Lorraine's hands had tilled the earth. Slowly, the couple realized they were not just fixing a house. They were creating a sanctuary, a place that reflected resilience, faith, and quiet defiance. Word of their progress spread in town. At first, people had mocked them. But as the seasons changed, even skeptics couldn't deny what Joseph and Lorraine had accomplished. Travelers passing through would stop to admire the cabin, now painted a warm shade of honey brown, with flower boxes under the windows. Some began calling it the paradise in the mountains. For Joseph and Lorraine, the praise didn't erase the pain of abandonment, but it brought a sense of dignity that racism had tried to steal. Yet, the ghosts of their children never truly left. Lorraine often set aside a jar of preserves or a loaf of bread, imagining one of them might finally knock on the door. She kept the letters in a wooden box under her bed, rereading them until the words blurred. Joseph, though less outwardly expressive, carried the ache in his silence. He would often linger by the mailbox, knowing full well that no reply would come. But even in their sorrow, they found purpose. Local children who wandered through the woods sometimes came upon the cabin. Lorraine welcomed them with pies. Joseph showed them how to mend tools or carve wood. Some of those children came from broken homes, hungry for kindness, and in the Matthews' presence, they found the warmth of family. It was as though Joseph and Lorraine's love, rejected by their own, had found new soil to grow in. Still, challenges loomed. One harsh winter, a snowstorm nearly collapsed the roof again. Another year, vandals sprayed hateful slurs on the fence near their property, a reminder that racism was never far, even in isolation. Lorraine wept as Joseph scrubbed away the words, his hands shaking not from weakness, but from the weight of carrying such cruelty all his life. And yet, through every storm, every insult, every lonely night, they pressed on. Their bond deepened. Their love for the land grew. The cabin, once ruined, now radiated beauty. Vines curled gracefully along the porch, the garden burst with abundance, and the air around their home seemed lighter, as if the mountains themselves had chosen to protect them. By the time Joseph turned 75 and Lorraine 72, the cabin was no longer just a house. It was a monument to survival. It was a testament that even when stripped of family, of acceptance, of belonging, two souls could still carve paradise from the ashes. But their journey was not without one final, heart-wrenching test, a moment when the past would come rushing back, forcing Joseph and Lorraine to face the deepest wound of all. It was a late autumn evening when the sound of tires crunching over gravel pierced the quiet stillness of the mountains. Joseph had been chopping firewood, his back bent, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly air. Lorraine was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew fragrant with herbs from her garden. They both froze at the sound. Visitors were rare in those parts, and when cars did appear, they were usually lost travelers or curious hikers. But as the engine cut off and the door creaked open, Lorraine caught sight of a figure she had not seen in nearly 2 decades. Her hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron, her breath caught in her chest. It was Angela, their eldest daughter. Her hair was streaked with gray now, her frame thinner than Lorraine remembered, her face carrying lines of exhaustion that no mother wanted to see on her child. Angela did not smile. Her eyes, filled with hesitation and something darker, scanned the cabin, the garden, the flowers that bloomed defiantly in the autumn chill. Joseph, gripping his axe, stood frozen for a moment, then slowly laid it down. His heart pounded, not from the labor of chopping wood, but from the storm of memories flooding back, the birthdays, the graduations, the bitter words exchanged in anger when she walked away. For years, silence had been their only answer from their children. Letters unread, calls unanswered, empty chairs at Christmas. And now, here she was, standing at the edge of their paradise, carrying a suitcase that looked far too light for a woman of her age. Lorraine's first instinct was to rush forward, to embrace the daughter she had prayed for night after night. But something in Angela's eyes stopped her. It was not just weariness, it was shame. As she stepped inside the cabin, Angela's story spilled out. Her life, once promising, had unraveled in painful ways. She had married young, seeking stability, but her marriage had collapsed under the weight of debt and betrayal. Her career never soared as she had once boasted it would. And now, she was alone, carrying wounds she had no place to heal. The bitterness that once fueled her departure had burned her bridges, leaving her with nowhere else to go. Lorraine listened, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Joseph, sitting in the corner, felt a war raging inside him. Part of him ached to reach out, to pull her back into the safety of the family she had rejected. Another part of him burned with the memory of abandonment, the years of silence, the cruel rejection, the way their children had chosen the world's lies over their parents' truth. Angela admitted something that cut deeper than any insult, that in her younger years, she had been ashamed of them. Ashamed of her Black parents, ashamed of their poverty, ashamed of the way society looked at their family. She confessed that classmates' whispers, society's judgments, and her own pride had poisoned her. And though she had once believed distancing herself would bring her freedom, it had left her hollow. The words pierced Joseph and Lorraine like knives. They had known, deep down, but to hear it spoken so plainly was almost unbearable. Lorraine's heart broke not for herself, but for the years wasted, for the love rejected, the holidays spent in loneliness, the laughter that could have been. The cabin, usually filled with the crackling of firewood and the scent of earth and herbs, now held only silence. Joseph rose slowly, his body heavy with age and grief. He walked to the window, his back turned, his shoulders shaking. He had built this place to protect their hearts from the cruelty of the world. And now, the very source of their deepest wound had returned, seeking shelter. Angela begged to stay, even just for a while. She had no other family, no home to return to. She looked around at the cabin, at the walls patched with love, at the garden blooming with resilience, and her voice cracked as she said, "You made a paradise here. I thought you had nothing. I was wrong." The moment demanded a choice. Joseph turned, his face lined with both anguish and strength. Would he harden his heart, guarding it against further betrayal, or would he open it once more, risking the pain of rejection again? Lorraine, her hands clasped in silent prayer, already knew her answer. She could not abandon her child, even if her child had abandoned her. Joseph's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low and trembling. He told Angela she could stay, but only if she understood what it cost them to forgive. Only if she respected the sacredness of the life they had built in the ruins. Angela wept, and for the first time in decades, Lorraine held her daughter in her arms. The embrace was not the joyous reunion of a fairy tale. It was heavy, trembling, soaked in tears of regret and longing. But it was real. That night, as the fire crackled and the stew simmered, Joseph and Lorraine sat with Angela at their table. For the first time in years, a third chair was filled. Yet the weight of absence lingered, 5 other children still gone, still silent, still unreachable. This moment was both a victory and a wound, both a healing and a reminder of what had been lost. The cabin that had become their sanctuary now faced its greatest test. Could it hold the weight of reconciliation, or would old wounds tear it apart again? The days that followed Angela's return were a fragile balance between hope and pain. Lorraine, with her boundless tenderness, treated her daughter's presence as a gift she had prayed for. She cooked larger meals, filled Angela's room with quilts she had stitched by hand, and watched over her with the same care she had once given when Angela was a child. Joseph, however, remained quieter. His love was there, deep and steady, but guarded. He worked long hours outside, tending to the garden and chopping wood, as though labor could help him sort through the storm inside his heart. Angela, humbled by her circumstances, began to help around the cabin. She cleaned, she gathered herbs with her mother, and she listened to the soft rhythm of mountain life. For the first time in years, she saw the strength of her parents not as a burden, but as a miracle. What they had built here was not just a home. It was a testimony of perseverance, a paradise raised from abandonment and scorn. Yet healing was not instant. At night, Angela sometimes wept quietly, guilt pressing down on her chest. Lorraine would sit beside her, stroking her hair, whispering prayers for peace. Joseph, from the other room, heard the muffled sobs and felt the sharp tug of memory, the long winters when no child's voice had filled their home, the heartbreak of letters unopened. Forgiveness came slowly, not in a flood, but in drops that softened the hardened soil of his spirit. Winter arrived, covering the cabin in a blanket of snow. One evening, Angela ventured into town with Joseph to fetch supplies. The stares she once feared, the ones that had driven her to distance herself, were still there. Some looked at her with pity, others with judgment. But this time, she stood taller, her father's presence beside her a shield of dignity. She realized that the shame she had carried was never theirs to bear. It had been imposed by a world unwilling to accept love that defied race, bloodlines, and prejudice. That night, back at the cabin, she confessed this to Joseph. Her voice trembled as she admitted how cruel words from strangers, the whispers of classmates, and the pressure to fit in had poisoned her love for the very parents who had given her everything. Joseph listened in silence, his hands folded on the table. When she finished, he looked at her with weary eyes and said only one thing: "The world tried to tell you lies. We told you the truth. You chose the world. But the truth is still here, waiting." It was not a full embrace, but it was a crack in the wall that had stood between them. And in that small opening, healing began. As weeks turned into months, Angela found herself becoming part of the rhythm of the mountain. She discovered a peace she had never known in her frantic life away from them. She began writing letters herself, not to her siblings, who still remained distant, but to others who had once known her parents. She told them about the cabin, about the garden, about the way two elderly black souls had carved paradise from ruin. She wanted the world to know what she had once refused to see: the quiet heroism of Joseph and Lorraine. One spring afternoon, as the apple blossoms bloomed around the cabin, Lorraine placed a hand on her daughter's and whispered, "This home will outlive us. When we are gone, let it remind you of who you are and where love brought you back." Angela wept, realizing that the cabin was not just a shelter. It was a legacy. The Matthew story did not end with a grand reunion of all 6 children. The other 5 never returned, their silence a permanent scar. But in a way, that was the lesson, the truth that love is not always repaid, that sacrifice is not always recognized. Yet, even in abandonment, Joseph and Lorraine's lives had borne fruit. Their garden fed neighbors, their kindness raised up children who had stumbled upon their cabin, and their resilience inspired those who once doubted them. When Joseph passed quietly one summer morning, sitting on the porch he had rebuilt with his own hands, Lorraine and Angela held each other through the grief. The cabin, bathed in sunlight, stood strong, a monument to a man who had refused to let bitterness win. Lorraine, though frail, carried on with Angela by her side. Together they tended the garden, kept the chickens, and welcomed travelers who still stopped to marvel at the little paradise hidden in the mountains. In the end, Joseph and Lorraine's story was not about what they had lost, but about what they had built despite loss. It was a reminder that dignity does not come from the approval of children, neighbors, or a prejudiced society. It comes from love lived out every single day, even when the world turns its back. And perhaps that was the most powerful legacy of all, that in the face of abandonment, racism, and hardship, they had chosen to create beauty instead of bitterness, paradise instead of ruin. The Matthews journey reminds us that love, even when unreturned, has the power to transform ruins into sanctuaries. It shows us that racism, rejection, and abandonment cannot erase the dignity of those who choose resilience. And it challenges us to see the worth of those we overlook, to cherish the people who have poured love into us, and to never let society's lies steal the truth of who we are. So, as you finish hearing their story, remember Joseph and Lorraine, not as victims of abandonment, but as builders of paradise. Let their legacy echo in your own lives, that no matter what the world takes from you, you still have the power to create something beautiful.